Good evening. So let's pull out the short sheet. So which one of these did we do last night? Does anyone remember, one or two? One. So tonight let's do two. All together. Hail, O Queen of Heaven. Hail, O Lady of Angels. Hail thou root, hail thou gate, from whom unto the world a light has arisen. Rejoice, O glorious Virgin, lovely beyond all others. Farewell, most beautiful maiden, and pray for us to Christ. Father, Son, Holy. All right, are you kind of figuring out which one of these you like better? Okay. So, a couple of things. The title of the mission, or the title of these talks, our theme when we started was, As it is above, so it is below. And so, like a lot of things, you're going to see this be repeated in areas that are not Catholic. What we don't realize a lot of times is our faith pervades everything, pretty much everything. So there's a Catholic context to almost everything. So for instance, I'll ask you, how many of you on the back of the dollar bill, there are two mixed symbols. There is a pyramid, and then on the top of it, it's got an eye, and there's some rays. Remember this symbol? Okay. How many of you think that's a Freemasonic symbol? It is. But the all-seeing eye has been a connotation or a symbol of God Almighty since the 2nd century. And so what you're going to find is what Freemasonry does, is what the diabolical does, is they co-opt, they mimic. And so the reason that they do that is so no matter what a man's religion is, when he walks into the lodge, he will see something that he recognizes, whether he's a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Baptist, it doesn't matter what he is. If he walks in there and looks around the lodge, he's going to see something. And so in the same way, there's a lot of the symbols that come out of the Catholic Church that find their way into Protestantism. The cross, for instance, where does that come from? It comes from Calvary. It comes from that origination of that church. And so then it takes off into all kinds of directions, and the symbolism sometimes gets mixed. But where do you find that phrase, as it was above, so it is below? You find it in the Our Father. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses, lead us not into temptation. You see, all of these things exist in the ethereal before they exist in the tangible. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So that concept is not a Freemasonic concept or a Freemason concept. They don't come up with anything new. They borrow. But this is what the demon does, is he borrows from the righteous. Everything that he has is an aping or a mockery of what's in the church. And it's the same with regard to what Father, when just a few moments ago, Father conferred a blessing upon us in the formula found in Hebrews. So that's a benediction, a blessing. What is the opposite of a blessing? A curse. So which came first? The blessing. In the 2nd chapter of Genesis, it's the first time this word appears. God blessed them, saying, go forth and multiply, subdue the earth, and bring it under your dominion. And so the demon hears this, sees that this is where we are most conformed to God, and so this is where he seeks to impede grace, impede that medium of communication. So when one begins to study grace, it's much like the study of pneumatics. You know what I mean by pneumatics? Air. Pretty fancy word, isn't it? Same as saying the study of hydrology. What's that? Water and how it flows. Pneumatics is air and how it behaves. And so we can call it air, or we can call it pneumatics. Many of the saints will tell you that all communication with God is a form of grace, and grace takes many varying forms. The point is that God is omnipresent. He's always there. Air is always there. You can choose not to breathe. Let me know how that works out for you. But it's the same with regard to grace. We can choose to ignore God, but He's always there. And at some point, you're going to do something that there's an interior prick of conscience. You're going to do something that is against the natural law. And what we're seeing in our nation and in our country right now is that evil militates to absurdity, to the point that anyone can see it. So for anyone who has made excuses, and that's fine, because that's I'm not calling you into account, but what we find is that we make excuses for people's behavior until the behavior becomes so absurd that you can no longer make excuses for it. There are those who that behavior may have crossed the threshold a long time ago. And then there are others that no matter how long they hold out, at some point it becomes obvious. Do you see that that's where we are? So even in our own life, we can embark on a path that leads away from God, following our own pleasures, following our own things. And then at some point we have that prick of conscience. Something that we do, we realize that's not good for me. And then when you turn back to God, that's when you're disposed to the grace. Does that make sense? And so there can also be, as a product of grace, this enlightenment, this flash of enlightenment, this flash of illumination. Have you ever seen, especially when you've asked to be holy or to be a saint, when your life is illumined with that light, you see all the things that are not consistent with God? That moment of illumination, you're not learning anything you didn't already know or that you didn't already understand as a concept. It's just that it clicks into place. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a working of grace. So this morning we talked about grace flows through, every bit of grace flows through the sacrificial act of Christ on the cross. And that sacrificial act is the conformity of will. And another takeaway that we had this morning was the sins against identity, against your identity, how you were born, those right structures, all the order of authority, those sins are against God the Father. Rebellion against your Father, rebellion against authority, right order, those are attacks against God the Father. Attacks that where we want to avoid suffering, we want to avoid pain, we want to avoid anything that is uncomfortable. Those are sins against hope. Those are sins against the Son. And then any sins against charity, meaning the desire for salvation to others, including not telling them the truth, not confessing Jesus. These are sins against the Holy Spirit. So do you see how that works? If you desire salvation for some and not for others, that's a defect in charity. Do you recall the scripture where our Lord is speaking and He says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect"? The sun shines on the just as well as the wicked. The rain falls on the good as well as the bad. So that perfection that He's talking about is the perfection of constancy, is to treat every creature with justice and to treat every creature with charity. Charity is the desire for salvation. It doesn't mean you let them stay in their sin. It doesn't mean you affirm them in their sin. It doesn't mean you enable them. Because all of these, the reason I'm going down through this litany, is all of these serve as impediments to grace. They impede the flow of grace. So let's look at, did everybody get their hand out? Okay. So I've pretty much quit drawing. All right, so we're on the back side of page 1, and I think that's probably going to be as far as we get. Do you see the back side of page 1? It's got all the blue filled out across the bottom, and it's got motherhood. Okay, good. So in that one, what we see is we talked about this first station or this first role is as a son is to receive love unconditionally. Did we go through that last night? Okay, great. So now the next step is as a brother or a sister or a sibling. Did we talk about last night that sibling rivalry is not of God? Okay, sibling rivalry is not of God. So what is this station? Is to unconditionally share love. To share love unconditionally. What is that sharing of love? It means that we desire the good for our brother. We desire the good for the other. It's not a competition for the attention of our parents. How many of you have multiple children? How many of you loved the first one? The first one, you loved him all you could. And then you had a second one. So where'd that love come from? The second one will tell you he only got half. And the first one will tell you the second one took all of it. But that's disordered. And so what happens is God increases our capacity to love. And as we pray and as grace flows to us through this new role of fatherhood and motherhood, our capacity to love is expanded. Our capacity to work in charity is expanded. Because I'm going to guarantee you that if you'd told me that I was going to get up at 2:30 in the morning consistently for anyone, I would have said you're nuts until I saw Annie, my daughter. So even Valerie, if she's going to wake me up at 2:30 in the morning, can't you take care of that yourself? The point that I'm making is it expands our capacity for love, our capacity for charity. But that's tied up with the willingness to make sacrifice, the willingness to pour yourself out. So any hesitation to do that, so the sharing of love unconditionally. That's a tough one. It's the willing the good for the other. It is the desiring of the good, the desiring of union. And you find yourself even advocating. So whenever your brothers or your sisters were in trouble, did you advocate for mercy for them? If you did, you were a holy and exceptional child. Because mostly we don't do that. But this is one of the things that the mother is so pivotal in. Here she's shaping the father as a construct in the heart of the child, in the heart of the son. And that's authority, that's right order. It's the understanding that everything flows from God through the office of the husband, through the office of the father. And so she's shaping that child's response to authority. You got a rebellious mother, you're going to have rebellious children. You're going to have a hard-headed mother, you're going to have hard-headed children. If you've got a controlling mother, you're going to have controlling children. This is part of nurture. This is simply the way that's going to take. And if you've got boys in that family under that controlling mother, they're going to have a disordered relationship with women. And they're going to be the first ones to leave the faith. Unless the father's praying and the spiritual head of the house. Where the father's the spiritual head of the house and he's praying and leading that family going to Mass, those kids stay in the faith. Test me on it. Now, I'm not talking about the revert. I'm not talking about the guy who has the come to Jesus moment when the kids are 15, 16, 17 and raised in a pagan house. They're not going to go through the same conversion or reversion. Does that make sense? I love the big Catholic families. You can read the names of the children and you know exactly where the reversion happened. You got Haley, Madison, Taylor, Boniface, Innocent, John Paul. So somewhere between Taylor and Innocent, there was a reversion that happened. The point is that the mother has everything to do with creating this atmosphere. Because that's going to be the atmosphere of the house. Competition is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it has to be tempered. So you've got the Feast of Cyril and Methodius in the new calendar, and this is an example of holy competition because each one of them spurred the other to greater heights of holiness and study. How many of you got that friend that when you're around them, you want to be a better person? That's holy competition. That's holy friendship, that we bring out the best in each other rather than enable the worst. So one other story about this, there was a woman who had 2 boys. She comes down and she says, boys, it's in the morning. She says, I've only got enough oatmeal for one. Did we already tell this story? Yeah. And so this is the example of this sharing. So now, only now, are you ready for spousal role, which is to give love, meaning give self unconditionally. So in marriage, is that a 50-50 proposition? Trick question. Is that a 50-50 proposition? No? It's not a partnership? Do you hear it described that way modernly? Well, it's not. Either one. It's a solemn contract. It's 110, 110. It's 110% on this side and 110% on this side, and you got to be willing to do your part when the other one doesn't do. And you got to be willing to do their part until they can. And so that understanding brings us to what is spousal union. So it doesn't matter if it's a priest, it doesn't matter if it's a married or religious, it's got to be a total gift of self without reservation. There are no days off for a husband. There's no days off for a wife. There's no days off for a father or a mother or a priest or a religious. Because once you're conformed in that vocation, that's the path. And so you totally lose yourself, done correctly, you totally lose yourself in this marriage or in this spousal union, in that vocation. You'll see on the blue line what the mother's doing is this is union. And that union has to supersede. It has to always flow out of the primary vocation, the primary union, which is husband and wife. How much modernly do we see families divided once the children come? The children, instead of being a unifying factor, are a dividing factor. So in marriage prep, I think that you ought to play the newlywed game in marriage prep with the questions on... You remember the old newlywed game? So the question is... 3-year-old boy breaks dishes when you told him not to be up on the counter. What's the penalty? So you're asking the fiancés what's the penalty? You see how much better these questions are than what's your favorite color? These are the questions you need to get worked out before the kid climbs up on the counter. These are the questions that you got to get worked out. What are we going to do about discipline? What's going to be our expectation? Because any of us with children... And they need to have mentor couples, because all of us went through this. That first child's born and you said things like, it'll be perfect because it's my child. There'll be no need for rules. There'll be no need for rules, and I will never say the things my father said. Fast forward, suddenly there's rules and you hear your father's words coming out of your mouth. And so that happens over and over and over again. And so the understanding is the parents have to be the unified front. You're going to learn, they need to learn, and newlyweds need to learn, one of their most powerful things to say to a child is, what'd your mother tell you? What'd your father tell you? Who else have you asked? So I get a lot of questions that come in the email from people who think they're diabolically afflicted. And so they ask the question, and one of my first responses is, who else have you asked and what else did they say? Because you need to know if your answer is going to be used as a weapon, as license, or does somebody actually want the answer? 9 times out of 10, it's the first part. They're looking for a weapon or they're looking for a license. So this union unconditionally, because your children are going to see, for women, your children are going to see how you respond to the husband. And they're going to see your interactions, and they're going to model, their ideal of marriage is going to be modeled off of your marriage, either in the positive or the negative. They're going to see in your marriage everything they don't want to do. They're going to see in your marriage everything that causes grace to flow, that creates peace in the house, that creates joy in the house. And it's amazing how this repeats, this bears out. Because have you ever seen children who they choose to marry is exactly like their parents? Girls, if they've got an exemplary father, most of the time they'll pick a guy that's like him, and vice versa. And so this is a very important skill set, because what happens with the flow of grace through the sacrament is this individual is dependent upon this avenue for the flow of grace, but something's happening in the sacraments. We've got baptism. So the Holy Spirit is present and this person's receiving grace, but the grace it's receiving is coming through, this soul is receiving grace, but the grace is all flowing through the marriage. Then by the time he's reaching the age of reason and completing or learning this skill set, he's at the age of reason. And he gets, do you guys do First Communion or Confirmation first? First Communion? So at the age of reason, he's getting First Communion. At the same time that he should be having this skill set at least functional. And then by the time he's ready for spouse, he's been confirmed. So now grace is starting to flow through his own participation in the faith. And by the time he's confirmed and declares that the Catholic faith is his faith, not the faith of his parents, is consistent, but you understand what I'm saying, is confirmation is consistent with bar mitzvah, where the soul is now responsible for its own path, for its own spiritual life, because it should be out of the house if it's a male. So what happens is now there is a new path of grace that flows through vocation. And so now grace comes directly to this soul. And if it's married, it comes to both souls in the marriage. Do you see with this diagram and showing the flow of grace, do you see the importance for it to be a Catholic marriage, for it to be the sacrament of matrimony? Because the capacity of grace of two confirmed Catholics who are living their faith and entering the sacrament of matrimony, you've just built a huge castle, a huge institution to convey grace. Make sense? Okay. Next spot, parent. So motherhood, fatherhood, and now you are ready for the responsibility for a soul beyond the two of you. So I ask you, what happens if this is birth? What happens if a soul goes from here to here without going through here? So there is a difference between being a father and being a sire. There's a difference between being a mother and being a dam. How many of you have heard the term the baby daddy or the baby mama? How many have you heard that term? I heard it for the first time about a month ago. I said, explain that to me. So the ability to sire a child does not make someone a father. So the understanding of vocation and being responsible for a soul, fatherhood and motherhood, but both of those, especially fatherhood, because the father, the male, is the one that's directly responsible for the soul. So that's something that is extremely significant. That's a huge office, and it should be decided by a superior. It should be decided by a superior. The diocesan priesthood is a bit of an anomaly. That's most of the priests that we are aware of modernly. But for 19 centuries, priests were formed in orders. And so oftentimes a man's ordination to priesthood may be delayed till he was in his 40s. He may be a brother for years and years and years. He may be a transitional deacon for years and years until a superior saw in him the spiritual maturity and stability to administer the sacraments and to be responsible for souls. What is the burden that Father has, or what is the obligation and responsibilities for your souls as a community? It's no less. And so fatherhood should be up to a superior. And it should be up to, in the case of a parent, it's up to God. Whether a marriage has children or doesn't have children, that's up to God. And so to live in that anticipation, to live in that formation. But when we engage in the conjugal act outside of marriage, we've already gone outside the flow of authority, the right use of authority. We've already gone outside grace. Because many people say, well, in order for it to be a sin, you have to know it. I can pretty well guarantee you that premarital sex, there isn't anybody that knows that that's okay. Not at all. Not at all. It's up to God. You pray for children. You say we're open to children and God will send them or He won't. There may be something biological that prohibits it. There may be, but the open to life, that's the test. It's not that you must bring forth life. You must be open to life. You must do nothing in opposition to it. And so this includes the misuse of NFP. This is a political landmine area, and the demon wants it to be. But I will tell you that in a lot of times, MFP is misused. It's used as a form of contraception. If you want to regulate children, regulate the act which brings about children. Regulate it in its totality. This is the right ordered use of the act. How hard is that to hear with our modern ear? It's real hard. It's really hard. But I'm going to tell you, the demon is all over it. The more he can do to profane the conjugal act, to disrupt the conjugal act, to turn it away from giving glory to God and toward base pleasures of men, that's what his aim is. Remember, that's the first blessing. It is the very first blessing. It's the first thing that God says to the marriage, to them. Go forth and multiply, filling the earth. And so the regulation of the conjugal act, the stewardship of the seed, is the responsibility of the man. Do you see how disordered we've become? Okay. So fatherhood, motherhood, you absolutely lose yourself. Whatever vestiges of yourself were still here are absolutely gone when you're a father. You don't believe me? When you got married, you were still concerned about how you looked. By the time you walk into Mass with that baby, you got puke down your shoulder on your suit. And it's all good. And so it's a redefining. Now let's move over into this one. And this one is the patriarchy and matriarchy role. And this is where the real power is. Prayer power. So in this one, so all this stuff that you've built up, over here's where we got to be detached from all of that stuff. Children and grandchildren especially. How many of you know that woman or that man that is spiritually strong? They are a warrior. But they will go into anxiety and worry when you bring up a grandchild that's not baptized. That's our Achilles heel. That's the place where we're the most vulnerable. And the demon is even going to say things like, if you'd raised those children right, your grandchildren would be baptized. You ever hear that one? Sure, because that's the way this game is played. And that's where the demon goes, is where you're the most vulnerable, where your attachment is. That's all he's got on you. So the patriarchy and matriarchy is to get above that, to maintain a position of clear view, of counsel. This is the spiritual high ground. And it is hard to get there. It is very hard to get there. But the wisdom that you have, if you can keep your peace, the wisdom that you have will benefit all of these generations that you're praying for. Because now you know how to pray. Pray from a position of peace. Pray from a position of detachment. Pray with your primary goal being salvation, not their behavior. Does that make sense? We get caught up in wanting to regulate their behavior. Yes, Father. Job certainly. Paul occupies a special place. He doesn't qualify as a patriarch. He doesn't reach that point. I think that when Paul dies, he's very much in this area right here. He's established all those churches, but he hadn't gone back to them. He hadn't gotten back. And so Paul's, if you look at him from a flow of grace, Paul is a rock star. He goes in, he wows them. They're all converted, and then poor old Barnabas and poor old Timothy, they're the ones who have to do all the heavy lifting. Patriarchy and matriarchy is all heavy lifting. It's all heavy lifting. It's Job. It is the story of Job. It is throughout the trials, Job starts with what he thinks is a right relationship with God. And then by the end of it, now he's got a deep relationship with God. We talked about relationship is built upon proximity and frequency. And Job was a just man. He was a good man, but he wasn't a holy man. At the end of it, he's a holy man because he spent all this time in close proximity with God, talking with God, praying. And at the end, he has reached some place that he wasn't at the beginning. If you walk through Job, there's several themes going on. And one of them is that at the end, God is talking to one of the friends, and he says, ask Job to pray for you. So he's been elevated to intercessor. That's what a patriarch and a matriarch are. Is you've got wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge with a bruise. You've got experience, you've got the functional theology, you've lived this long, and there's a lot of things that you would do different, but this is what gives you the long look. This is what gives you that bigger vision, if you will, that bigger picture. You see things more in a reality. Yes, sir. The patriarchy and matriarchy, you're an abject failure if all of your children are not fourth-degree knights with grandchildren who serve the Mass. That's what he's doing, that's what he's saying, and it's all he's got. So what the patriarch does is he doesn't focus on what he doesn't have. He focuses on what he does have. And so it's much easier to focus on those kids that you got baptized, that you took to First Communion, that you got confirmed. And so the prayer of the prodigal father is it's a very simple prayer. It is called the Light of Christ prayer. Lord, let them see themselves as you see them, and let me see them as you see them. This brings about that prick of conscience that brings them to their senses. And the thing is they simply haven't been beat up enough. They haven't come to that crisis point. They haven't gotten knocked down enough to realize that, hey, salvation may have value. Because a lot of young people today, salvation has no value because they don't perceive the peril. They have to perceive the peril, first of all. I mean, all of us had a period in our life where we really thought insurance was a superfluous thing. And now we're all of an age that we realize that you better have some insurance. Yep. And so the patriarch and matriarch role, she's right, is to be in a place of peace. It's not saying not to go visit, but you don't want to go visit them if they're in the pig pen because you don't want to enable. This is a hard part. This is a really, really hard part. Is our interaction with people who are not realizing the consequences of their sin. And how else will they realize the consequences of their sin if there are no consequences? This is a tough part. Now, again, this is a landmine. This area is full of landmines. But there is a couple of features that I want you to know. Is that even though it's not said, But when you go to your son's house who's living with a woman he's not married to, when you go over there for Thanksgiving dinner, you're affirming that union. If you allow him to bring her into your home and they share a bedroom, you're affirming that union. This is the hard part. And you'll say, we'll drive them away. Yes, you will. Yes, you will. And then they can come back. But there has to be consequences. This is extremely hard to hear. Here's another thing that we got to realize, especially with regard to homosexuality, all the alphabet soup stuff. Those people, if they are diabolically afflicted, and that's most of the time, they cannot be silent around your minor children. They want to be affirmed in their lifestyle, and they cannot be quiet around minor children. Your children, their nieces, their nephews, however they're related. Over and over and over again, we see that. So you're responsible for the souls in your care. Our Lord is not going to ask you at particular judgment. He's going to say, did you tell the truth? He's not going to say, you didn't offend anyone, did you? This is the tough part. But to the extent we don't do that, then we're vulnerable to the adversary. I'm not telling you you have to do that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you have to answer for the consequences if you don't. And the demon is going to take advantage of that. Yes, Father. Okay, sorry. Okay, the church doesn't recognize that as a sacrament of matrimony. It's very clear that the marriage within the church is the sacrament of matrimony. The sacrament of matrimony is what conveys grace to the marriage and to the children. So a marriage outside the church has got little to no chance to survive. Statistics bear me out. No, what I'm saying is if there's no recognition of the union by any authority whatsoever, they're living together. I made it a point to say they're living together without benefit of marriage. And so that's what's immoral. The fact that they're married outside the church is not necessarily immoral. The fact that they're not married and living in an adulterous or fornication relationship, that is immoral. Remember, our test for obedience, where we go, where we can't go, has to be morals and doctrine. Because if you go to a place that you know to be morally bankrupt or to be immoral, then you're vulnerable, de facto. And the other side is going to see it as license or affirmation. Sure. It does not have the same spiritual stature as the sacrament of matrimony. It's not a sacrament. You're condoning what they've done, but it's not. The test is not. They're not immoral. Do you see the difference? And so here's a good example with regard. And let's stay here until we get all this lined out. Throw as many scenarios as you want to throw. It's just and we'll work through them, because it's all from a position of what makes you vulnerable to the adversary. What gives him a hoofhold, because what he's doing is he's trying to get you not to pray from this position of power. That's what he's trying to erode. That's what he's trying to knock down, so that your prayer doesn't have the merit, that you're not a, quote, just man. And the prayers of a just man are heard. What is that in James? I believe, letter of James, maybe in Hebrews. But it's more in more than one place. The other point that I was going to make, sacrament. So we went through the understanding that baptism, we recognize baptism outside the church. We recognize it as valid, correct? And then it's entered into the sacramentary once it can be verified. So, Father, if I come to you and I say, I'm married outside the church, I'm married in a civil union, and I want my marriage blessed or senated by the church, what do you tell me? So does the marriage, can it conform to Catholic norms for the sacrament? That's what he's saying. And so let's suppose that in this scenario, I've been married once before, she has not. What does he mean, got to fix it? First of all, we got to establish, was the first marriage valid? Is there a Pauline privilege? There's some canonical things to go through. The point that I'm trying to make is, any marriage has the possibility of being made to conform to Catholic norms. You don't have to get remarried. That's the point that I'm trying to make. The point, yep. And right. And so it can be made, the term is senated. In other words, it can be made to conform to Catholic norms, provided we're eligible for marriage in the church. So the issue is the issue of authority. Are they willing to allow the church to be the authority in their marriage? And that's really the sticking point. And so that's where the adversary wants to be, is for people not to submit themselves to the governance of the church. Does that make sense? This is tough stuff. This is the place nobody wants to go. This is dead man's curve. No, you don't ever walk away from your grandchildren. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is what you can't do is condone in any way immoral behavior. Now, you also don't need to talk to the grandchildren about it, because they're in no position to do anything about it. So you reserve all your comment for only those people who can do something about it. But you tell the truth every chance you get to tell the truth. And I'm not telling you can't go over there to eat dinner. What I'm telling you is when you do that, you're vulnerable. You step outside of any protection that you have. When we in a state of grace enter a place that we know is immoral, then you got to answer for that. The same way you got to answer for the votes that you cast, the company you keep, the job you have. If the company that I work for is giving money to promote the homosexual agenda, I got some issues. I got some stuff I've got to answer for. If the company I'm working for is promoting any of these things that are promoting abortion and the right to abortion, then I've got to be consistent with regard to who I am, what I say, and what I do, because the demon's looking for that inconsistency. So we're getting to the point, it's not there yet, but you're getting to the point where there's not a suspicion of immorality. Immorality is known, and your children are being indoctrinated in immoral practices. Once that happens, you have an obligation to protect them. Yeah, you have an obligation to protect them. So why are you using them? So why are you using them? Well, that'd be a good line, beauty or health. That's the line for plastic surgery. That's precisely, people ask all the time about plastic surgery or procedures. If it doesn't have anything to do with health, the preservation of health or reconstruction, then de facto it's self-harm. The church has always defined this as self-harm, precisely. So this was one of the first century responses that they drilled into the martyrs during the first century persecution. And the quote was, they were always offered the chance to offer sacrifice to the Caesar or to deny Christ. And their pat response was, better to die in obedience than live in apostasy. So again, you remember you moved from avoiding sin to pursuing holiness. And so once you set down that path and once you step over into pursuing holiness for the sake of holiness, for the sake of sanctification, for the desire to be unified with God, then things change. And so your sensibilities change. If you do something to your body, if you alter your body, then that's going to be something that you probably may rise to sin, to the level of sin. Making choices, wearing makeup, doing these kind of things may not rise to the level of sin. That, again, is an interior disposition. For what purpose are you doing it? If a married woman is wearing cosmetics to be attractive to other men or to gain a position in a workplace or something like that, now we're moving into an area that is sinful. And so, again, it's going to be the gauge of morality. Is there a moral defect? Is there a moral transgression involved in the use of it? Even if it's in a venial thing, in a venial, does it cause an unease, a disrest? Does it interrupt your peace? That's the question. So again, where are you in that spectrum? And I can't answer that. I mean, that's something that you have to answer for yourself, right? When you're living in a neo-pagan culture, which is where this is no longer Christian culture, so you're in a neo-pagan culture. So whatever the mores and norms of the culture, do 180 opposite, and you got a pretty good idea of getting it right. Yeah, you don't have that power. So if he comes to you for counseling, and I think it's a very, very good point, thanks for the opportunity to make it, is you don't have right of command over your brother, but you have the obligation to counsel so that when they come to you. And so I've got a brother-in-law that cycles by about once every 3 years. He can take me for about 30 minutes once every 3 years. And it's always on the exact same subject. And so he comes by once every 3 years, we do the 30 minutes, and I don't see him again. It'll take about a year, and then I'll hear something. But he's drawn to the truth. He's not drawn to me. He's drawn to the truth. But he's also drawn to He's Valerie's brother, and so he's also drawn to the understanding that we're in a very functional marriage, an over 40-year marriage. It's a very functional marriage, and we're still very much in love with each other and in love with the Lord. And so there's a stability there that he wants. And so he keeps asking the same question, how do you get that stability? Well, there's only one answer, and that's the only way I know to do it. As you pray together, you live together, you totally discuss everything. We're best friends. I've been best friends with her for 45 years, married to her for 42. And so that's that relationship. And I'd like to say the same about the Lord. He's always been my best friend, but I've not always been his. Yes, sir. It helps. It helps. It's always easier to be martyred with 40 than by yourself. I've always thought that, there's no way we got the martyrs of Sebesta coming up. There's no way that they would have frozen me to death in a pond by myself, but I might do it with 40 other guys. So I can help you keep from getting sucker punched. Did she ask you what you thought? So I'm giving you some really good advice here. If she didn't ask you, don't volunteer. No. You don't volunteer the church's position. She's not asking you for counsel, and you have no authority. So counsel is a very delicate area. Doesn't matter. So for instance, if you look me in the eye and you tell me that you did something that is against the faith, I'm going to continue to look at you until you say, what do you think about that? Or does the church have a position on that? Then you'll get what I have to say, but not until you ask. So this is the respect for that other person. When she starts talking about it, do you fish? Okay, for the fishermen in here, the way you fish, if you're fishing with a worm and you got a float, and you got a cane pole, and you're watching that cork, as soon as that cork starts doing like that, you don't set the hook. So as soon as she starts talking about it, you just wait, because the cork's bobbing. It ain't gone under yet. So if you want to set the hook and set it deep and get her landed, you got to let her take it. The best answer is it's inconsistent with the Catholic faith, no matter what a prelate or a priest may say, because you can priest shop now. You can go and find a priest who will say most anything if you hunt hard enough. So it's interesting. I get these things. I asked a priest, and he said, and so I've gotten to where I ask him, how many priests did you ask before you found that one? Because they're having to hunt for this voice, but counsel is best given, and especially with your children. You can practice it on strangers, perfect it with your children. As you look at them, you watch that cork. You just watch it and watch it and watch it. You wait for it to disappear and stay under, then you can set the hook. It's like my brother-in-law. I hadn't set the hook yet. He's took the bait several times, but he keeps spitting it out, but he keeps coming back. And so you got to keep giving them the same truth, but the truth is simply that's inconsistent with our faith. Does that make sense? And so then what's happening is that seed is starting to grow. How are we for time? Well, we're to this question and answer part. So it's a good question. So in the case, and it's more common that the male is absent, you still have to honor the office. And so the woman discharging that office, if she can find her father or her father-in-law or a male voice to help her in the house, that helps. The oldest son, she can start talking to him about helping with regard to being a male presence in the house. But it's very, very important that the office of fatherhood is honored even if it's vacant. And so that's a very important thing, is because to understand that authority comes into that marriage through that office. And so it's always to acknowledge that office even if it's vacant. Same. So you're always going to honor that office. And then by the same token, if a man finds himself without a mother to the children, without a wife, then he needs to seek a feminine presence that can provide a nurturing presence, because men just don't do that well. To provide a nurturing presence. We don't realize that you're supposed to brush a little girl's hair and talk to her while you're doing that. We don't get that. We don't get that she's going to be very concerned that her socks match. We don't get that. No. So the office is absent. So what we got is, again, we got her skipping all the way over here to being a mother, not going through formation. Was she confirmed? Okay. So she went to here, but she didn't get this part, the total gift of self. Does that make sense? She gave herself, but it wasn't rightly done rightly. And it wasn't a gift of her total self. It was a gift of her physical self, probably. I'm surmising that's generally what happens. So where does she practice the faith? Excellent. And so I think you talk about, ask her, what's drawing you to the Trinity, and which person of the Trinity are you drawn to? And then explain to her, this is faith, hope, and charity. This is authority. This is conformity of will. This is doing for others. And so just start, once you get her mind thinking in that circuit, then grace will start to work. But if she's already been confirmed, is she going to Mass? Is she eat His flesh and drink His blood? Ask her. And so the children, baptized? Excellent. How old are they? First communion? The girl? Is the 18-year-old been confirmed? Excellent. You got a lot to work with. You got an awful lot to work with. So she needs to have a really good relationship with St. Joseph. A really, really good relationship with St. Joseph. Is there a functional male figure in her life, human? Catholic? So there needs to be a functional male figure in her life who's Catholic. That's good. That's good. What does her father tell her? So she really needs to hear it from her father. And so the father needs to, how is her relationship with her father? Wonderful. Really work on that relationship, because the office of that male office, that fatherhood is he still can discharge that role. And so you've got a biological tie, you've got all of those things. Is she asking for counsel? Okay. Then you're 3/4 of the way home. She's discharging the authority of the father. Do you see the difference? She doesn't become the authority. She's simply discharging that in his absence. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Absolutely. Nothing is lost. Yeah, like I said, I'll lay out plan A, and we're all living plan C, D, E, L, M, N, O, P. We're living way past plan A, and the thing is that we're never beyond hope. Well, the thing about it is in the error, there's greater chance. In the correction, there's greater merit. So if you never deviate, you don't have the merit of correction. And so that merit of conversion, that merit of correction, that's not to be understated at all. That's what we're talking about. Wisdom is knowledge with a bruise. And by the time you get to here, you recognize that it would have been nice if I'd driven on the pavement the whole way. Any more? All right, so we're just going to go to the mat. You ready? Do you have a homosexual son? You got no authority over the brother-in-law. You got anybody over authority that you have a direct authority over that's homosexual? Then don't even think about this guy. You know what's right. Don't even think about this guy. Because if you've got to find that kind of cartoon priest to give license to what you want to do, you're so far out of... I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the deviants. And we got to be ready for, this is coming into our church. And so there has always been a canonical a prohibition against the ordination of men with homosexual tendencies. Incidentally, it's absolutely ridiculous, the idea that a priest could have consensual sex with anybody, much less homosexual. Because once ordained, everything they do has a ritualistic context. It's a priestly context. And so we've ignored these canon laws for the last 60 or 70 years, and now we find ourselves in this situation. But when you're in a church where a Mitch Packwaz laicized and a James Martin preaches on with promotion from the Holy See, that tells you where you are. What did I say? I misspoke. It's one way to look at it. The more important thing is well, primarily it's against the consecration that set you aside for a sacred purpose. Correct. You're going to live it because you took the vow. But that's the important part, is to realize that, I mean, we know a lot more than we do. We want to feign confusion. We want to feign anxiety. It doesn't concern us. I mean, it is what it is. It's deviancy, and it's always been deviancy, regardless of what the psychologists have decided to reclassify it. It's still the second sin that cries out from the earth, that cries out to heaven. Did we talk about the sins that cry out to heaven and are reserved to apostolic pardon? So there's the sins that require apostolic pardon, meaning the forgiveness of a bishop, and they are excommunicado ex operandi, meaning when you do them, you are excommunicated by the doing of them. And that includes murder. Specifically with regard to abortion, if you in any way facilitate the abortion, if you procure it, if you promote it, if you give her a ride to the place where it happens, if you're the practitioner, all of these are excommunicatable offenses. This is why Nancy Pelosi cannot take communion in her home diocese. You can't publicly promote it. But our bishops are already divided on this. And so this is one of the sins that cries out from the earth. It cries out to heaven. The second one is sodomy. We've already had the Holy Father this last week say that it should be decriminalized. Just telling you what he said. Okay. It's a good question. It's a good question. What we're seeing in Washington is the charges made, the evidence is laid, and the case is done to convict people in Senate hearings, and nothing happened. But what I'm saying is it's pandemic. It's across the board. It's across the board. We don't have a corner on immorality. He always is. He always is. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so as you present this to me, the questions that I would ask, number one is, what is she to you? What is the authority structure? Okay, okay, now I'm confused. I got it. But it wasn't your daughter.
Stepdaughter.
Now I got it. Okay, so she's your stepdaughter. Does she come to you for counsel? Is she in your house? Okay, so it's going to be really difficult for you to have any input. So this is the fishing. You got the bait out, you just sit there and you wait. So you've told her the truth. You've told her the truth. If she asks for counsel, you simply say it's inconsistent with my faith. You'll pray that light of Christ prayer. Were you her stepmother when she was baptized? Okay. How old was she when you came into her life? Was she going to Mass with you? Okay. She was baptized in the Catholic Church and then... Got it. And her father, your husband, is deceased? Okay. So the commonality is you both love the same man. And so best thing to do is ask for his intercession. So pull out all the stops. All's fair in love and war. And this is both. So what you do is you ask for his intercession. You pray that she sees herself as the Lord sees her. That she see herself as her father sees her and always saw her. And so that brings you toward a moment where there's a prick of conscience. And then when she asks you anything, be careful not to use the word marriage, because what she's in is not a marriage. And so we as Catholics can't use marriage to describe that relationship. You see what I mean? So this keeps you up on the high ground. Well, that's one word for it. Yeah. No, you can't. It's not a wedding. No. First of all, the people who need the warning, you're going to sound like the adults in Charlie Brown. The people who really need Father's homilies are not here when they're given. But Father's exactly right. These are the incursion points. Because if the demon can figure out where you do not agree or assent to Catholic doctrine, there's where the psychological compatibility is going to start. There's where the conversation is going to start. Correct. There's something you agree on. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so we don't have that power, nor do we have that authority. So your prayers are for the purification and preservation of the church. Understand that looks like James Martin coming out and becoming more and more outrageous. Remember that principle that evil militates to absurdity. And so when you pray for purification, when you pray for conversion, when you pray for these things, realize that the first movement is going to be exactly opposite what you want to see. Because this is going to animate the demon. He's going to get, just like Pharaoh, he's going to become obstinate, hard of heart. He's going to up the ante. And then when he does that, it'll become obvious to everybody. You've got all kinds of middle-of-the-road Catholics now. You've got an awful lot of Catholics who voted Democrat that are saying, we can't do that. We shouldn't do that. But it's got to get to absurdity before that prick of conscience. For many of us, that happened a long time ago. But right. It's close. It's close. I think you're very, very close. And so the way that the church has always viewed these things is there are moral deviants. And so this would be labeled as a moral deviancy, meaning it's against the natural. It's an inclination that is against the natural law. And so if someone gives in to that, then they're going to go down that path. But all of us have inclinations that are against the natural law. I'm a murderer. I'm a rapist. I'm a thief. I am all of those things, but I am not practicing today. I'm making a conscious decision not to engage in thoughts requisite with a fallen humanity. And so it's a specificity of a deviancy, but once it's engaged in, then it becomes very difficult. So if I have a tendency to do violence, to murder, once I do that, it's going to be very, very difficult unless that result is such a hard prick of conscience and I realize with horror what I've done. Does that make sense? And so you have to look at it first and foremost as a moral deviancy. And psychologists and everybody else classified homosexuality as a mental health issue, as a deviancy, all the way up until about 10 years ago, and they changed the DSM. And so if we're going to change that definition, but they're also looking, there's all kinds of behavior, horrible, immoral behavior, that is simply now a psychological state. Yeah, it's a first visible sign of the covenant made with Noah that he would no longer destroy the world by water. So when was the last time fire rained down? Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. If you see it, sure, that's precisely what they're doing. All good? See you in the morning.